Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like gentle mist across cobblestones, where mysteries wait in applestones, where mysteries wait in the soft glow of lamplight, and where sleep finds you gradually, peacefully, as we wander together through shadows and secrets. Tonight, we journey to Victorian London, to the familiar rooms of Baker Street, where rain whispers against window panes and the fire crackles its ancient song. This is a story designed to slow your thoughts, to let your mind drift like autumn leaves on still water, to guide you softly toward peaceful sleep as we unravel a curious case together. Before we begin our tale properly, I wonder where you are joining me from tonight. Perhaps you are nestled in blankets as rain falls outside your own window, or maybe the stars shine clear and cold where you rest. Wherever you find yourself, know that you are welcome here. In this space, we create together with words and imagination. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The evening had drawn its curtains early across London, bringing with it a particular quality of dampness that seemed to seep through stone and mortar, through the very fabric of the city itself. In the rooms at 221 B. Baker Street, the fire had been built high against the October chill, its flames dancing and flickering across walls, lined with books and curiosities, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The air held the mingled scents of burning coal, old leather, pipe tobacco, and the faint mineral coolness of rain-soaked streets drifting up from below. Sherlock Holmes sat in his favourite armchair, the one positioned to catch both the fire's warmth and the window's grey light, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in an attitude of profound contemplation. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance, his mind clearly occupied with matters that required no spoken word. Dr. John Watson, his faithful companion, sat opposite with the evening newspaper spread across his lap, though he had long since ceased reading its columns. Instead, he found himself observing his friend with that mixture of concern and curiosity that their years of acquaintance had made familiar. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked its measured rhythm, each second falling soft as snowflakes into the comfortable quiet of the room. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, patient whisper, the kind that spoke of hours yet to fall, of a night given over entirely to water and wind. Gas lamps along the street below flickered behind their glass shields, their light reflecting in puddles and whetstone, creating a world of doubled illumination, of reality and its liquid mirror. Watson shifted slightly, the leather of his chair creaking in gentle protest. "You have been uncommonly quiet this evening, Holmes," he ventured at last, his voice pitched low so as not to shatter the contemplative atmosphere too abruptly. "Is something troubling you, or merely occupying that remarkable mind of yours?" Holmes stirred as if waking from a light trance, though Watson suspected his friend had been entirely aware of every sound and movement in the room, despite his apparent abstraction. A small smile touched the detective's thin lips. "Merely occupying, my dear Watson. I have been considering the curious nature of artistic inspiration, and whether there exists any scientific basis for the romantic notion of the possessed creator, the artist driven by forces beyond their conscious control." Before Watson could respond to this rather philosophical observation, the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside drew both men's attention toward the door. These were not the steady tread of Mrs. Hudson bringing tea, but rather a more hesitant, irregular ascent, punctuated by pauses that suggested uncertainty, or perhaps physical distress. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest, his posture subtly shifting from repose to readiness. The knock, when it came, was soft, almost apologetic, as if the visitor feared to disturb the peace of the evening, yet felt compelled by some pressing need. "Come," Holmes called, his voice carrying easily through the heavy door. The figure that entered seemed almost to materialize from the rain-soaked darkness beyond. A woman wrapped in a dark cloak that dripped steadily onto the landing, her face pale beneath the shadow of her hood. She stood framed in the doorway for a moment, and Watson noticed how the firelight caught the water droplets clinging to the fabric of her garment, making them glitter like scattered diamonds. Mrs. Hudson appeared behind her, concern written clearly across her kind features. But Holmes gestured that their visitor should be admitted. "Please, come in from the rain," Watson said warmly, rising from his chair and indicating the seat nearest the fire. "Mrs. Hudson, perhaps some tea for our guest. She appears thoroughly chilled." The woman moved forward with small, careful steps, as if uncertain of her welcome, or perhaps simply exhausted. As she lowered her hood, the firelight revealed a face of perhaps 30 years, with dark eyes that held a peculiar intensity, a gaze that seemed to look through rather than at the objects of its attention. Her hair, dark as midnight, had been pulled back severely, though several strands had escaped to curl damply against her temples. There was something in her bearing that suggested both refinement and recent hardship, a combination that immediately engaged Watson's professional sympathy. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, each word seeming to cost her considerable effort. "Dr. Watson, I have come because I know not where else to turn. My brother, you see, my brother is possessed." The word hung in the air between them, stark and strange against the rational comfort of the firelit room. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers now pressed together in that characteristic pyramid of concentration. "Possessed," he repeated, giving the word neither mockery nor credence, simply acknowledgement. "A strong term, miss." "Ashworth," she supplied, removing her wet cloak with trembling hands, revealing a dress of dark green that had once been fine, but now showed signs of neglect, small stains and wrinkles that spoke of days worn without proper attention. "Clara Ashworth. And yes, Mr. Holmes, I know how it sounds. I know what a man of your rationality must think. But I assure you, there is no other word that captures what has befallen my brother Edmund." Mrs. Hudson arrived with tea, the cups rattling softly on their saucers as she set the tray down on the small table between the chairs. The familiar ritual of pouring, the gentle splash of liquid into porcelain, the sweet smell of bergamot rising in steam, seemed to steady Miss Ashworth somewhat. She accepted her cup with both hands, as if seeking its warmth more than its contents, and Watson noticed how her fingers trembled despite her obvious efforts to control them. Holmes waited with that particular patience he reserved for witnesses in distress, allowing the tea and the fire's warmth to work their restorative magic before pressing for details. When Miss Ashworth finally began to speak again, her voice had gained a fraction more strength, though it remained pitched in that low, almost dreamlike register that seemed to match the rain's whisper outside. "Edmund is a painter," she explained, staring into her teacup as if reading answers in its depths. or rather, he was, a portrait artist of considerable talent and reputation. We lived together in our family home in Bloomsbury, the house where we were raised. It has been just the two of us since our parents passed some 5 years ago. Edmund's work sustained us comfortably, his portraits sought after by families of distinction who appreciated his remarkable ability to capture not merely likeness, but essence, the very soul, he always said, of his subjects. She paused, taking a small sip of tea, and Watson observed the way her throat worked with the swallow, as if even this simple action required concentration. The fire crackled suddenly, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room in dancing light, before settling back to its steady glow. 3 months ago, Miss Ashworth continued, everything changed. Edmund took a commission to paint the portrait of an elderly gentleman, a Lord Blackwood, who had recently returned from many years abroad. The sitting took place at Lord Blackwood's residence in Mayfair, as the old man claimed his health prevented him from travelling. Edmund was excited about the commission, both for the generous fee and for the challenge of capturing what he described as a most interesting face, marked by experience and shadow. Before you fall asleep tonight, write in the comments what time it is where you are and where you have joined us from. Holmes's eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity that Watson recognized as complete attention. And the sittings proceeded normally? The detective inquired softly. At first, yes, Miss Ashworth replied, her voice dropping even lower, so that Watson found himself leaning forward to hear. Edmund would return each afternoon speaking of the work's progress, of how Lord Blackwood sat motionless as marble, hardly speaking, his eyes fixed upon some distant point, as if seeing through the walls of the room into vistas beyond mortal sight. But then, after the 4th sitting, Edmund came home changed. The word fell with weight, with finality. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, drumming harder against the windows before subsiding once more to its steady whisper. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly, and the sound seemed to echo through the walls like a sigh. Changed how, precisely? Holmes asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the nature of the answer. Miss Ashworth set down her teacup with exaggerated care, as if fearing her hands might betray her with sudden movement. He no longer paints portraits, she said quietly. He paints only one subject now, obsessively, endlessly, day and night. The same face, the same eyes, over and over. The face of Lord Blackwood. Our house, Mr. Holmes, is filled with canvases bearing that terrible visage. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds by now. Edmund works in a fever, barely eating, rarely sleeping, his hands moving as if guided by some will other than his own. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night, and he glanced at Holmes to find the detective's expression had grown very still, very focused. And these paintings, Holmes said carefully, do they vary at all, or are they identical reproductions? They vary, Miss Ashworth whispered, and now Watson could see genuine fear in her dark eyes. Fear mixed with something that might have been desperate hope, that these two men, these rational investigators of London's mysteries, might somehow make sense of what seemed to defy all reason. They vary in the most disturbing way imaginable. Each painting shows Lord Blackwood's face at a different time, a different age. Some show him as he is now, ancient and terrible. Others show him younger, middle-aged, in his prime. And some, Mr. Holmes, Some show him in periods long past, wearing clothing from centuries ago, with backgrounds that suggest eras far removed from our own. The fire settled lower in the grate, its flames casting longer shadows across the walls, and the 3 occupants of that room sat suspended in a moment that seemed to stretch and deepen, opening onto questions that touched the very boundaries between the explicable and the impossible. Silence settled over the room like a physical presence, thick and weighted with implications that seemed to press against the walls, against the very air itself. Holmes remained motionless in his chair, his grey eyes fixed upon Miss Ashworth's pale face, with an intensity that might have been unnerving had it not been so clearly born of intellectual fascination rather than skepticism or disbelief. Watson found himself acutely aware of small sounds, the soft hiss of rain against glass, the whisper of settling coals in the grate, the distant rumble of a cab passing in the street below, its wheels splashing through puddles that reflected the scattered lamplight like fragments of fallen stars. Centuries ago, Holmes repeated at last, his voice maintaining that same measured calm that Watson had heard him employ in circumstances ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. You say some of these portraits depict Lord Blackwood in clothing and settings from centuries past. Can you be more specific, Miss Ashworth? What periods, precisely, has your brother rendered in these paintings? Miss Ashworth drew a shawl more tightly around her shoulders, though the room was warm, as if the chill she felt came from within rather than without. Her dark eyes moved from Holmes to Watson and back again, searching their faces, perhaps for signs of dismissal or mockery, finding instead only serious attention. "There is one," she said slowly, her words emerging with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed a statement many times in private, fearing disbelief. "That shows him in the dress of an Elizabethan courtier, with a ruff collar and doublet of black velvet. The background suggests a manor house of that period, all dark wood panelling and leaded windows. Another shows him in what appears to be medieval monk's robes, standing before a stone altar in some ancient chapel. And there are others, Mr. Holmes, so many others, each depicting this same face across different spans of time." Watson shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. His medical mind sought rational explanations, even as another part of him, the part that had followed Holmes into stranger territories than most men dreamed existed, remained open to possibilities that defied conventional understanding. "Has your brother any particular interest in history?" he asked gently. "Might these paintings represent some form of imaginative exercise, a fancy taken to unusual extremes, perhaps due to overwork or nervous exhaustion?" The suggestion hung in the air, hopefully, a lifeline of normalcy extended across the growing strangeness of the tale. But Miss Ashworth shook her head slowly, a gesture of such sadness that Watson felt his heart contract with sympathy. "Edmund was never particularly interested in history, Dr. Watson. His passion was for the living subject, for capturing the present moment, the current expression. He considered historical painting rather dull, in fact, preferring the immediacy of contemporary portraiture. And as for nervous exhaustion—" She paused, her hands twisting together in her lap. "That would not explain what I have witnessed with my own eyes." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the arms of his chair, his fingers once again forming that characteristic steeple beneath his chin. "And what have you witnessed, Miss Ashworth? Beyond the paintings themselves, I mean." Has your brother spoken of his process, of his inspirations, of why he feels compelled to paint only this single subject? The fire chose that moment to collapse slightly, sending up a small fountain of sparks and causing the shadows in the room to shift and dance across the walls like living things. Miss Ashworth watched these shadows for a moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, forcing both men to strain slightly to hear her words above the rain's persistent murmur. "He speaks," she said, "but not to me. He speaks to the paintings. I have stood outside his studio door in the hours before dawn, when sleep eludes me, and the house creaks with the settling of old timbers, and I have heard him conversing with the canvases as if they were living companions. He addresses them as 'my lord,' asks them questions, laughs at responses I cannot hear. And sometimes, Mr. Holmes, sometimes I hear another voice answering him from within that locked room, though I know Edmund is alone." Watson felt the small hairs on the back of his neck rise despite the room's warmth. He glanced at Holmes and saw that his friend's expression had sharpened, the detective's mind clearly racing through possibilities and permutations, seeking patterns in what seemed like chaos, order in what presented as madness. "This other voice," Holmes said carefully, each word measured and precise. "Can you describe its qualities, its tone, its accent, whether it sounds near or distant?" Miss Ashworth closed her eyes, and Watson noticed how exhaustion had carved fine lines around them, shadows beneath them that spoke of many sleepless nights. "It sounds," she said slowly, as if pulling the memory from some deep well within herself, "like an old man's voice, dry and papery as autumn leaves, speaking English with an accent I cannot place. Not foreign, exactly, but archaic, as if someone from long ago were speaking our modern tongue with ancient inflections. And it sounds, Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, as if it comes from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing somehow within the walls themselves." The three of them sat in tableau for a long moment, the fire painting them in shades of gold and amber, while the rain sang its endless song against the windows. Watson reached for the teapot, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of refreshing their cups, the gentle splash of liquid into porcelain, providing an anchor of normalcy in a conversation that had drifted far from ordinary shores. The bergamot scent rose again, sweet and grounding, and he saw Miss Ashworth accept her refilled cup with a small nod of gratitude. Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace and moved to the window, drawing aside the heavy curtain to look out into the rain-swept street below. His profile against the grey light beyond held that quality of absolute concentration that Watson had learned to recognize as the prelude to decision. For several minutes he stood thus, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass, the gaslight from the street lamps below casting wavering illuminations across his angular features. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," he said at last, not turning from the window, his voice carrying a new note of determination. "This Lord Blackwood, who commissioned the original portrait, what do you know of him? His history, his reputation, the nature of his business abroad?" Miss Ashworth seemed to consider the question carefully, her brow furrowing slightly with the effort of recollection. "Very little, I am afraid. Edmund mentioned that he was a reclusive gentleman, that the house in Mayfair was kept shuttered and dark, that servants spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. He had been abroad for many years, Edmund said, travelling through distant lands, collecting artifacts and curiosities. The few glimpses Edmund had of the house suggested rooms filled with strange objects, masks and statues from cultures I could not name. Books bound in leather so old it seemed ready to crumble at a touch. And the portrait commission itself, Holmes pressed, still gazing out into the rainy darkness. Was it completed? Did your brother deliver the finished work? A longer pause followed this question, and Watson saw Miss Ashworth's hands tighten around her teacup. "I do not know," she admitted finally. Edmund stopped speaking of the commission after that fourth sitting. He simply began painting, endlessly painting, these other versions. The original portrait may still sit unfinished in Lord Blackwood's residence, or it may have been completed and delivered. My brother will not discuss it. He will not discuss anything anymore, except when he speaks to those terrible canvases. Holmes turned from the window at last, the curtain falling back into place behind him, enclosing them once more in the room's warm, firelit intimacy. He crossed to the mantelpiece and stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the marble surface, his eyes distant with thought. The clock beside his hand ticked on its measured way, marking seconds that fell like drops of water into a deep well, each one carrying them further into the mystery's depths. "I should like to see these paintings," Holmes said quietly, his decision made. "And I should like to speak with your brother, if possible. Would he receive visitors, do you think? Or at the very least, might we view his studio in his absence?" Relief flooded Miss Ashworth's features, transforming her pale face with an expression of such profound hope that Watson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Oh yes," she breathed. "Yes, please, Mr. Holmes. Edmund locks himself away most hours, but he sometimes walks in the evening, late, when the streets are quiet. If you could come tomorrow, perhaps we might enter the studio then. I have a key, you see, one that he does not know I possess. I had it made from an impression out of desperation, though I have been too frightened to use it alone." "Then tomorrow evening it shall be," Holmes agreed, and something in his tone seemed to fill the room with renewed purpose, with the promise of action after too long spent in passive fear. "Shall we say 8 o'clock? That will give us the cover of darkness and the likelihood that the streets will be quiet enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention." Miss Ashworth nodded eagerly, setting down her cup and rising from her chair, as if sudden energy had been restored to her weary frame. 8 o'clock, yes. The house is in Bloomsbury, on a quiet street called Wentworth Place, number 17. Oh, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot express what it means to me that you will help. I have been so alone with this, so terribly alone, not knowing whom to trust with such a strange tale. Watson rose as well, moving to help Miss Ashworth with her cloak, which had dried somewhat by the fire's warmth, though it remained damp in its folds. "You are not alone now," he assured her gently, his physician's instinct to comfort asserting itself. "Whatever the explanation for your brother's condition, we shall discover it together." Morning arrived with a transformation of the city's character, the rain having ceased some time in the small hours to leave London. Washed-Eve London washed clean and gleaming beneath a sky of pale pearl grey. Watson woke to find Holmes already dressed and seated at the breakfast table, surrounded by newspapers and reference volumes, pulled from the shelves, his long fingers moving rapidly across the pages as he scanned column after column of text with that remarkable speed that never ceased to impress his companion. The smell of coffee mingled with the lingering scent of last night's fire, and weak sunlight filtered through the windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazy as dreams through the still air. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said, without looking up from his reading, somehow always aware of his friend's presence, even when apparently absorbed in research. "I trust you slept well, despite our visitor's rather unsettling narrative. I have been conducting some preliminary investigations into the mysterious Lord Blackwood, and I confess the results are more intriguing than I had anticipated." Watson poured himself coffee from the silver pot Mrs. Hudson had left, warming by the hearth, the liquid dark and fragrant, and settled into his chair with the comfortable ease of long habit. Through the window behind Holmes, he could see the street below coming to life with the day's commerce. Delivery wagons rattling past, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, the occasional gentleman or lady passing on foot with that purposeful stride that characterized London's morning hours. Everything appeared utterly normal, utterly mundane. Yet Watson found his thoughts returning again and again to Miss Ashworth's pale face and trembling hands, to her brother painting endlessly in a locked room while conversing with canvases that might somehow answer back. "What have you discovered?" Watson asked, spreading marmalade across his toast with slow, meditative strokes, the knife making small scraping sounds against the bread that seemed loud in the quiet room. Holmes finally looked up, his grey eyes bright with that particular intensity that indicated his mind had latched onto a problem worthy of its full attention. "Lord Blackwood," he said, setting aside the newspaper he had been perusing, "is something of a phantom in society's records. He appears in the shipping manifests, having returned from Constantinople 6 months ago. But before that, his trail grows remarkably cold. There are references to a Lord Blackwood in various capacities, going back quite far, but the details are frustratingly vague and contradictory." He reached for one of the reference volumes, a heavy tome bound in cracked leather, and opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. There was a Lord Edmund Blackwood, who served in Elizabeth's court, noted as a patron of alchemists and scholars of the occult. A Lord Sebastian Blackwood appears in records from the early 18th century, involved in archaeological expeditions to the Middle East. And there are other mentions scattered through time, always peripheral, always involved in pursuits that society regarded as eccentric at best, dangerous at worst. Watson set down his coffee cup with more force than he intended, the porcelain ringing softly against its saucer. "Surely you do not suggest these are all the same man, Holmes? That would be impossible, would require a lifespan of centuries." "I suggest nothing yet," Holmes replied calmly, though Watson detected a note of something in his voice that might have been excitement tempered with caution. "I merely observe patterns and collect data. However, I have sent word to an old acquaintance at the British Museum, a gentleman who specializes in obscure historical records and genealogies. If there is more to learn about the Blackwood lineage, he will know it. We are to meet him at 2 o'clock this afternoon in the reading room, before we venture to Bloomsbury this evening." The morning passed in this manner, with Holmes alternating between focused research and brief periods of that peculiar stillness he adopted when allowing his mind to work through problems in its own mysterious fashion. Watson attended to correspondence and his own reading, though he found his attention wandering repeatedly, his thoughts drawn forward to the evening's planned investigation. The sunlight strengthened, and then began its slow decline, painting the room in shades that shifted from grey to gold, as the hours accumulated like sand in an hourglass, each grain marking their approach toward whatever revelations awaited. At 17 Wentworth Place. At precisely 2 o'clock, the two men descended to the street and hailed a cab, directing the driver toward the British Museum. The journey carried them through London's afternoon bustle, the streets alive with humanity, pursuing its countless purposes, each person wrapped in their own concerns and dramas, oblivious to the strange mystery that occupied the thoughts of the cab's occupants. Watson watched the city pass beyond the window, the familiar architecture of stone and brick, the parks where children played beneath the watchful eyes of their nurses, the squares where pigeons gathered in grey congregations around fountains that splashed and murmured their eternal songs. The British Museum rose before them like a temple to knowledge, its classical columns and imposing facade speaking of permanence and authority, of human understanding systematized and preserved. Inside, the reading room opened like a circular sanctuary, its domed ceiling soaring overhead, while below, scholars bent over volumes at long tables, their whispered consultations and the soft rustle of turning pages creating a hushed symphony of study. The air held the particular scent of old books, that complex perfume of aging paper, leather bindings, dust that had settled over decades, and the mineral coolness of stone. Holmes's acquaintance proved to be a small, bird-like man named Pemberton, whose wire-rimmed spectacles magnified eyes that shone with quick intelligence. He greeted them in whispers, appropriate to the sacred quiet of the reading room, gesturing them to follow him to an alcove where several volumes lay already opened, clearly prepared in advance of their meeting. Watson noted how Pemberton's hands, though aged and marked with liver spots, moved over the pages with the delicate care of a musician touching beloved instruments. "Your inquiry about the Blackwood family, Mr. Holmes, has led me down some rather extraordinary paths," Pemberton murmured, his voice barely audible, yet carrying clearly in the alcove's acoustic intimacy. "The records are fragmentary, often contradictory, but there are certain consistent threads that run through the centuries like a hidden river beneath the surface of documented history." He indicated one of the volumes, a medieval manuscript illuminated with elaborate initial letters that glowed jewel-bright even in the reading room's subdued light. Here, in the chronicles of a monastery in Yorkshire, there is mention of a brother Blackwood who lived in the 13th century, noted for his unusual longevity and his studies of ancient texts dealing with the prolongation of life. The abbot who recorded this entry notes with some concern that Brother Blackwood appeared not to age as other men did, that he remained vigorous and clear-minded even as his contemporaries grew feeble and passed into death. Watson felt a chill despite the reading room's comfortable temperature, and he leaned closer to examine the manuscript, though his Latin was insufficient to read the elaborate medieval script. The illuminated letters seemed to twist and coil like serpents, their forms suggesting something both beautiful and vaguely sinister. Pemberton turned to another volume, this one a collection of court records from the Elizabethan era. And here, the Lord Edmund Blackwood I mentioned. He appears in records for nearly 60 years, yet paintings from early in this period and late show remarkably little aging. He was involved in various philosophical societies, groups that studied alchemy, astrology, what we might now call the occult sciences. There are hints of scandal, accusations of unnatural practices, but nothing that came to trial or formal censure. Holmes stood absolutely still, absorbing this information with that complete focus Watson had witnessed countless times, his mind clearly assembling pieces of a puzzle that remained largely invisible to his companions. And more recently, he prompted quietly, what of the 19th century? Ah, Pemberton said, a note of something like triumph entering his whispered voice. That is where the trail grows particularly interesting. A Lord Nathaniel Blackwood appears involved in expeditions to Egypt and Mesopotamia, collecting artifacts from ancient civilizations. He disappeared in 1847, reportedly lost during an expedition to a remote monastery in Tibet. But then, 30 years later, a Lord Blackwood surfaces again, this time in Constantinople, dealing in antiquities and rare manuscripts. And now, this current Lord Blackwood has returned to London after decades abroad. A scholar at a nearby table coughed softly, a dry sound that seemed loud in the reading room's careful quiet. And Watson found himself starting slightly, his nerves more on edge than he had realized. Holmes placed a hand on one of the open volumes, his fingers resting lightly on the centuries-old paper, as if he might divine truth through physical contact with these historical records. Is there any physical description consistent across these various Blackwoods? Holmes asked. Any distinguishing features that appear in multiple accounts? Pemberton nodded slowly, removing his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief drawn from his waistcoat pocket. Eyes, he said simply. Nearly every description that includes physical details mentions the eyes. They are invariably described as dark, penetrating, of unusual depth and intensity. One account from the 17th century describes them as windows unto abysses of time, wherein a man might lose himself, as in bottomless waters. They thanked Pemberton and emerged into the afternoon, which had grown overcast once more, grey clouds gathering in layers that promised renewed rain before evening fell. The street outside the museum bustled with late afternoon traffic, cabs and carriages competing for space, vendors calling their wares, the whole magnificent cacophony of London going about its business. Yet Watson felt they carried with them something of the reading room's quiet, a bubble of thoughtful silence that accompanied them as they walked slowly back toward Baker Street. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked at length, when they had left the museum's immediate vicinity behind, and entered a quieter street where their words would not be overheard. "Surely you do not credit the possibility that one man could live for centuries?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, his walking stick tapping a rhythm against the pavement that matched their footsteps. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. "I do not know what to credit, Watson. My rational mind rejects such possibilities as fantasy, as impossibility, and yet I have learned through our adventures that the world contains wonders and terrors that defy conventional understanding. We must remain open to evidence, wherever it may lead, while maintaining our critical faculties against deception and delusion." The afternoon wore on toward evening with that particular quality of autumn light that seems to thicken the air itself, turning the world soft and indistinct at its edges, as if reality were gently dissolving into watercolour. By the time Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the clouds had descended lower still, bringing with them a fine mist that was not quite rain, but rather a dampness that hung suspended in the atmosphere, clinging to clothing and skin, beading on the windows like scattered pearls. Mrs. Hudson had lit the lamps early against the gathering gloom, and their warm glow welcomed the two men as they climbed the familiar 17 steps to their rooms. Each footfall on the worn carpet, a comfort of routine in the midst of mounting strangeness. Watson found himself oddly restless as the clock crept toward their appointed hour, unable to settle with his usual book or newspaper. Instead, moving about the room, arranging and rearranging objects that required no attention, straightening pictures that hung perfectly straight, adjusting curtains that needed no adjustment. Holmes observed these nervous movements with the faint smile of affectionate understanding, himself occupied with preparing certain items he deemed necessary for the evening's investigation. A magnifying lens carefully wrapped in soft cloth, a measuring tape, a small notebook and pencil, matches, and a dark lantern that could be shuttered to control its light. "You are anxious, Watson," Holmes remarked, not unkindly, as he secured these items in the pockets of a long coat he had selected for its numerous compartments. "It is understandable. We venture tonight not into the realm of ordinary crime, where motive and method follow predictable patterns, but into something that touches upon the extraordinary, perhaps even the impossible. Our footing is less certain in such territory." Watson paused in his restless circuit of the room, standing before the fire that crackled softly in its grate, the flames casting his shadow, long and wavering, across the floor. "I confess I am uneasy," he admitted. "Miss Ashworth's account, combined with what we learned from Pemberton, suggests something that challenges everything I understand about the natural order. And yet, I cannot dismiss it as mere fancy or delusion. There was something in her eyes, Holmes, a genuine terror that spoke of experiences beyond imagining." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, checking his pocket watch and noting they had 20 minutes yet before departure. "Terror is a poor liar. Whatever the truth of this matter, Miss Ashworth has witnessed something that has shaken her profoundly. Our task is to determine whether that something originates in external reality or in the fevered imagination of her brother, and whether either possibility poses genuine danger." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the quarter hour, its silvery notes falling into the room's warm quiet like drops of sound made visible. Holmes crossed to the window and drew aside the curtain, looking down into the misty street where gas lamps created halos of diffused light, each one an island of illumination in the gathering darkness. A cab passed below, its wheels hissing on wet cobblestones. The driver hunched against the damp, his horse's breath visible in the cooling air. "It is time," Holmes said quietly, and there was something in his voice that sent a small shiver through Watson, despite the room's warmth, a note of anticipation mixed with the caution of a man about to step across a threshold into unknown territory. They descended to the street and found a hansom cab waiting at the corner, as if the city itself had conspired to facilitate their journey. Holmes gave the driver the Bloomsbury address in a voice pitched low, and they settled into the cab's leather interior as it lurched into motion, carrying them through streets that grew progressively quieter as they left the commercial districts behind and entered the residential neighborhoods where evening meant drawn curtains, lit windows suggesting domestic scenes of dinner and fireside comfort, families gathered in the warm centers of their homes, while darkness claimed the spaces between. Bloomsbury welcomed them with tree-lined streets and elegant Georgian townhouses, their brick facades rising in orderly rows that spoke of respectability and quiet prosperity. Wentworth Place proved to be a particularly secluded street, almost an alley really, tucked away from the main thoroughfares, its narrow, cobbled length flanked by houses that seemed to lean slightly toward each other, as if sharing secrets across the gap. Number 17 stood near the middle of the street, distinguished from its neighbours by an air of neglect that was subtle but unmistakable. Curtains that hung slightly askew, a brass door knocker tarnished from lack of polishing, window boxes that held only the brown remnants of summer flowers gone to seed and decay. The cab departed, leaving Holmes and Watson standing in the misty street, the gas lamp at the corner providing only minimal illumination that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the shadows gathered around the Ashworth house. Watson found himself acutely aware of sounds: the distant bark of a dog, the rattle of a window sash somewhere in the street, the soft drip of water from eaves and branches, each drop distinct in the muffled quiet. No light showed in the windows of number 17, the house presenting a face of complete darkness to the street, as if it were not merely unoccupied, but abandoned, given over to emptiness and silence. Holmes raised the knocker and let it fall twice, the sound echoing somehow wrong in the damp air, too loud and too flat at once. They waited, Watson feeling the mist settle on his coat and hat, droplets forming and sliding down in slow procession. The door opened suddenly, startling despite their expectation, and Miss Ashworth appeared like a ghost materialized from shadow, her face even paler than it had been the previous night, her dark dress blending with the darkness of the hall behind her so that she seemed almost to float, disembodied in the doorway's frame. "Thank God you have come," she whispered, glancing past them into the street as if fearing observation despite its apparent emptiness. "Please, come in quickly. Edmund returned from his walk only minutes ago. He is in his studio now, and I dare not leave him alone there too long, but I wanted to greet you myself." They stepped across the threshold into a hallway that smelled of dust and old cooking, underlaid with something else Watson could not quite identify, a scent both acrid and sweet, that reminded him faintly of the chemistry laboratories from his student days. The darkness inside was nearly absolute, broken only by the single candle Miss Ashworth carried, its flame wavering with their movement and sending shadows leaping across walls, papered in a pattern that had once been elegant, but now hung in places peeling and water-stained. The house possessed an atmosphere of decay that went beyond mere physical neglect, as if some essential vitality had been drained from it, leaving only a shell that maintained the forms of domesticity while lacking all substance. Miss Ashworth led them up a narrow staircase, their footsteps muffled by a runner worn thin in the centre, each tread creaking softly as they ascended. Watson counted 13 steps before they reached a landing, then 7 more to the upper floor, noting these details with the automatic precision that Holmes's methods had taught him, though what use such knowledge might prove he could not say. The upper hallway stretched before them, darker still than below, lined with closed doors that suggested rooms long unused, surrendered to dust and silence. At the far end of this hallway, beneath the last door, a line of golden light showed brilliant against the surrounding darkness, and from beyond that door came sounds that made Watson's breath catch in his throat. The soft, rhythmic swish of a brush against canvas, punctuated by occasional pauses, during which a voice murmured words too low to distinguish. The voice was male, presumably Edmund Ashworth's, speaking in the tone one might use for prayer or incantation, each phrase carefully enunciated, as if the words themselves held power beyond their meaning. Miss Ashworth stopped several paces from this illuminated door, her hand trembling as she raised it to point. "There," she breathed. "He has been at work since he returned, and will likely continue for hours yet. Sometimes he paints through the entire night, until dawn finds him still standing before his easel, his eyes red from exhaustion, but still fixed upon the canvas with an intensity that frightens me more than I can express." Holmes moved forward with cat-like quietness, his footfalls making no sound on the worn carpet, and pressed his ear to the door. Watson watched his friend's profile in the candlelight, noting how Holmes's eyes closed in concentration as he listened to whatever transpired beyond that barrier of wood and paint. A full minute passed thus, marked by Watson's heartbeat, loud in his own ears, and the continued whisper of brush on canvas, before Holmes stepped back and turned to Miss Ashworth with an expression Watson could not quite read. "He speaks to someone," Holmes said quietly, "or believes he does. I cannot distinguish individual words clearly, but the rhythm is conversational, with pauses as if for response, though I hear only his voice." Miss Ashworth nodded, her face a mask of misery in the flickering candlelight. "Yes, always thus. And sometimes, Mr. Holmes, sometimes those pauses are filled with sounds I cannot explain, whispers that seem to come from the walls themselves, or from some space that exists adjacent to our own reality, just beyond the reach of ordinary perception." A floorboard creaked suddenly beneath Watson's foot, the sound sharp and startling in the hallway's tension, and immediately the painting sounds ceased. The voice beyond the door fell silent, and in that silence Watson could hear his own breathing, Miss Ashworth's sharp intake of breath, the rapid beating of his heart. They stood frozen, three statues in the hallway's gloom, waiting to see if Edmund Ashworth would emerge, would discover their presence outside his sanctuary. Long seconds passed, each one stretching into eternity, before the painting sounds resumed, the brush taking up its rhythmic whisper once more, the voice beginning again, its low, incomprehensible murmur. Watson released a breath he had not realized he was holding, and saw Holmes relax fractionally, though the detective's attention remained fixed upon that door with undiminished intensity. "The key," Holmes said, his voice barely a breath of sound in the hallway's oppressive quiet. "We must see what lies beyond that door. Miss Ashworth, if you would be so kind." "Shh, if you would be so kind." She fumbled in her dress pocket with shaking fingers, eventually producing a brass key that caught the candlelight and threw back fragments of golden gleam. Watson watched as she extended it toward Holmes, her hand trembling so violently that the key rattled against its ring, the small metallic sound seeming impossibly loud in the charged atmosphere. Holmes accepted it with a small nod of thanks and turned to the door. But before he could insert the key into the lock, the voice beyond suddenly rose in volume, the words becoming momentarily distinct through the wooden barrier. "Yes, my lord, I see it now," Edmund Ashworth's voice declared, with an edge of triumph, mixed with something that might have been desperation. "The pattern reveals itself through the centuries, the great spiral turning ever inward toward its center, toward the moment of completion. Each face I capture brings us closer, each rendering tears another veil from between the worlds. Soon, my lord, soon the work will be finished, and you shall walk freely once more in the realm of solid things." The words fell into silence, and in that silence, Watson heard something else. Something that made his skin prickle with primitive unease. A sound like wind moving through vast spaces, or like breath drawn by lungs far larger than any human chest could contain. A susurration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from within the walls and from beyond them simultaneously. It lasted only a moment before fading, leaving behind a quality of emptiness that felt somehow worse than the sound itself. Miss Ashworth swayed slightly, and Watson moved quickly to support her elbow, feeling how cold her arm was, despite the layers of fabric. "Steady," he murmured. "Perhaps you should wait downstairs, Miss Ashworth. There is no need for you to witness." "No," she interrupted, her voice firmer than Watson had yet heard it. "No, I must see. I must know what has become of my brother, what occupies him so completely that he has forgotten I exist, forgotten everything except these endless paintings. Whatever you discover beyond that door, I have a right to know." Holmes studied her for a moment, his grey eyes assessing, before nodding slowly. "Very well, but stay behind us, and if I give any instruction, you must follow it immediately without question. Watson, have your revolver ready if you please, though I hope sincerely we shall have no need of it." Watson drew the weapon from his coat pocket, where he had placed it before leaving Baker Street, the weight of it somehow reassuring in his palm, despite his uncertainty about what threat it might guard against. How did one shoot a painting, after all, or defend against voices that came from nowhere? Yet, the familiar heft of the revolver provided comfort through its connection to the tangible world of physical cause and effect, a talisman of rationality in circumstances that seemed to mock reason itself. Holmes inserted the key into the lock with exquisite care, turning it slowly to minimize the sound of tumblers falling into place. The mechanism clicked softly, and he paused, waiting to see if Edmund had heard. The painting sounds continued uninterrupted, the brush moving in steady strokes, the voice rising and falling in rhythms that suggested ritual rather than ordinary speech. Holmes grasped the doorknob, and Watson saw his friend take a deep breath, steadying himself, before turning it and pushing the door slowly inward. Light flooded into the hallway, bright after the darkness they had stood in, causing Watson to squint against the sudden brilliance. The studio beyond revealed itself in stages as the door swung wider. First, the golden glow of dozens of candles burning in clusters throughout the room, their flames steady in air that seemed curiously still. Then, the canvases that lined every available surface, propped against walls, stacked on tables, hanging from hooks hastily driven into the plaster, each one bearing the same face rendered in oils that gleamed wetly in the candlelight. And there, in the centre of this gallery of repeating visages, stood Edmund Ashworth himself. He was a man perhaps 35 years of age, though the ravages of his obsession had added years to his appearance. His dark hair hung lank and unwashed past his collar, and his clothes, once fine, Watson judged, though now paint-stained and rumpled, hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost considerable weight. But it was his eyes that arrested Watson's attention most completely. They held a feverish intensity, burning in a face gone hollow with exhaustion and something else, something that might have been ecstasy or might have been terror. The two emotions mingled until they became indistinguishable from one another. He stood before an easel near the room's centre, his brush poised over a canvas that showed yet another iteration of Lord Blackwood's features, this one depicting the subject in what appeared to be Renaissance attire, a heavy chain of office gleaming gold against black velvet. Edmund's hand moved with mechanical precision, adding detail to the eyes. Always the eyes, Watson noted, rendered with particular care, each one seeming to gaze out from the canvas with unsettling depth and presence. For several heartbeats, Edmund continued painting, apparently unaware of their intrusion, despite the door standing open behind them. His brush danced across the canvas with a surety that spoke of absolute mastery, each stroke confident and purposeful, building layers of shadow and light that created an illusion of three-dimensional depth. Watson found himself mesmerized by the technical skill on display, even as he felt repelled by the subject matter, by the repetition of that same compelling and disturbing face across canvas after canvas. Then Edmund spoke without turning, without any indication he had seen them enter, his voice carrying that same ritual quality they had heard through the door. "The pattern holds," he said to the canvas before him. 347 iterations across 7 centuries of recorded time. Each face a key, each portrait a door opening onto corridors of possibility. Tell me, my lord, how many more before the great work reaches its culmination? Holmes stepped forward into the room, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and Watson followed close behind, keeping Miss Ashworth positioned slightly behind them both. The studio's atmosphere felt thick somehow, charged with an energy Watson could not name, but that raised the fine hairs on his arms and neck. The candlelight seemed to pulse faintly, in rhythm with nothing Watson could identify, and shadows moved in the room's corners in ways that suggested presence rather than mere absence of light. "Mr. Ashworth," Holmes said clearly, his voice cutting through the strange atmosphere with deliberate normalcy. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Your sister has asked us to visit you, out of concern for your well-being." Edmund's hand paused mid-stroke, the brush hovering inches from the canvas, paint threatening to drip from its bristles onto the floor below. For a long moment he remained frozen thus, a statue of concentration, before slowly, so slowly, turning to face them. His eyes, when they met Holmes's, held an expression Watson found difficult to read. There was recognition, certainly, awareness of their presence, but also a quality of distance, as if Edmund Ashworth stood not merely across the room, but across some vast gulf of perception that separated him from ordinary human consciousness. "Holmes," Edmund repeated, the name emerging slowly, as if pulled from great depth. "The detective. Yes, Clara would summon you, would she not? She fails to understand the magnitude of the work, the cosmic significance of what unfolds here in this humble room. She sees only her brother's absence, not his transformation, not his elevation to participant in mysteries that transcend the merely personal." He set down his brush with exaggerated care, placing it precisely parallel to the edge of the small table that held his palette, and turned fully to face his visitors. In the candlelight, his features showed clearly the toll of his obsession, deep shadows beneath eyes that had not known proper rest in weeks, hollows in his cheeks where flesh had wasted from missed meals, a tremor in his hands that spoke of nervous exhaustion carried to dangerous extremes. "Transformation," Holmes repeated quietly, moving slowly through the room, his eyes taking in every detail, every canvas, every surface. Watson watched his friend's gaze travel across the paintings, noting how Holmes paused fractionally at each one, cataloguing, analysing, building that comprehensive picture that his remarkable mind would later dissect and interpret. "You feel you are being transformed by this work, Mr. Ashworth? By painting these portraits of Lord Blackwood?" "Not merely painting," Edmund said, and his voice took on an animated quality, his hands rising to gesture as he spoke, paint still visible beneath his fingernails, and staining his fingers in multi-hued testimony to hours of labour. Channeling, translating, pulling through from spaces beyond space, times beyond time. Each portrait captures not merely appearance, but essence, not merely physical form, but metaphysical presence. Do you understand? Each one is a doorway, a portal, a thin place where the membrane between worlds grows gossamer and permeable. Miss Ashworth made a small sound of distress, and Edmund's eyes flicked to her briefly, recognition and something that might have been guilt flickering across his haggard features, before being subsumed again in that feverish certainty. "Clara," he said softly, "dear sister, you were not meant to see this, not meant to know until the work reached completion. But perhaps it is fitting that witnesses gather as we approach the culmination. Perhaps the great unveiling requires an audience to give it proper significance." Holmes had reached the far wall now, where the canvases stood stacked 3 and 4 deep, and he knelt to examine the lower paintings, his magnifying lens appearing in his hand, as if by magic. Watson watched him peer closely at the surface of one canvas, then another, his expression growing increasingly intent. After several minutes of this examination, Holmes rose and turned back to Edmund with an expression Watson had rarely seen on his friend's face, a mixture of fascination and something that might have been concern. "These paintings," Holmes said carefully, "show remarkable technical consistency, despite apparent differences in execution time and physical condition. The brushwork is masterful throughout, showing no deterioration despite the obvious signs of your exhaustion. How long have you been working without proper rest, Mr. Ashworth?" Edmund laughed, the sound high and brittle in the candlelit room. "Rest? What is rest when eternity beckons, when the great spiral of time itself turns beneath my brush? I sleep when he permits it, when the visions cease their insistent pressing against the inside of my skull." The words settled into the studio's thick atmosphere, like stones dropped into deep water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward through the candle-warmed air. Watson felt the weight of that phrase, weight of that phrase, when he permits it, and understood that they stood now at the heart of the mystery, that whatever truth lay coiled within this room of endlessly repeated faces would reveal itself through patience and careful observation rather than direct confrontation. Holmes seemed to sense this as well, for he made no immediate reply to Edmund's disturbing statement, instead continuing his methodical examination of the canvases, moving from one to another with that peculiar grace he possessed, his long fingers occasionally reaching out to touch a surface, testing the paint's dryness, tracing the pattern of brushstrokes. Watson found his own attention drawn to the nearest painting, a 3/4 portrait showing Lord Blackwood in what appeared to be 18th century dress, powdered wig and elaborate waistcoat, rendered in meticulous detail. The technical mastery was undeniable, but more than skill in execution, the painting possessed a quality of presence that Watson found deeply unsettling. The eyes, dark and fathomless, seemed to track his movement even when he shifted his position, seemed to look through him rather than at him, perceiving something beyond, or perhaps behind, his physical form. Watson had seen many portraits during his years in London society, had visited galleries and exhibitions where the great master's works hung in gilt frames, but never had he encountered anything quite like this peculiar intensity, this suggestion that the painted figure possessed awareness and agency independent of the artist's intention. Miss Ashworth remained near the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame, as if needing its support to remain upright. Her face in the candlelight showed such profound sorrow that Watson's heart ached in sympathy, understanding how she must have watched her brother's gradual transformation from skilled craftsman to this haggard figure who spoke of permissions granted by his subject, who painted through exhaustion at the behest of forces he could not or would not explain. The silence stretched and deepened, broken only by the soft hiss and flicker of the candles, and the distant sound of rain beginning again outside. Gentle droplets tapping against windows like fingers seeking entrance. Edmund moved suddenly, crossing to a cabinet against the far wall, and opening it to reveal dozens more canvases stacked within, each bearing that same commanding face. "You wish to understand," he said, speaking now in a quieter voice, almost conversational, as if the presence of visitors had temporarily anchored him to more ordinary modes of discourse. "You come seeking rational explanation, cause and effect, neatly arranged in chains of logic that your minds can accept and catalogue. But this work transcends such categories, Mr. Holmes. It exists in spaces where your celebrated methods of deduction hold no purchase." Edmund's face underwent a curious transformation, shifting from the feverish intensity of moments before to something softer, almost wistful, as if Holmes's question had touched some memory that retained warmth despite the strangeness that now dominated his existence. He moved to stand beside a particularly large canvas that showed Lord Blackwood in contemporary evening dress, the figure life-sized and commanding, painted with such skill that it seemed another person stood in the room with them, solid and present. "The fourth sitting," Edmund said slowly, his hand reaching out to touch the edge of the canvas before him, his fingers trembling slightly, with either emotion or exhaustion. It was late afternoon, and the light in Lord Blackwood's study had taken on that peculiar golden quality that comes just before sunset, when the whole world seems suspended between day and night, between the ordinary and the numinous. He sat perfectly still, as always, but his eyes seemed to bore into me with such intensity that I felt myself becoming transparent, felt my own substance dissolving beneath that gaze, until I was nothing but vision and perception, nothing but the act of seeing and recording. A candle on the far side of the room guttered suddenly, its flame dancing wildly before recovering, and the momentary disruption of light caused all the painted faces to seem to shift, to turn slightly, as if following the movement of the flame. Watson blinked, and when he looked again, the paintings were exactly as they had been, yet the impression of movement lingered, unsettling in its suggestion of animation where none should exist. "He spoke to me then," Edmund continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing his listeners to lean closer to hear. "Not with his lips, you understand. Not in any ordinary manner of speech. His mouth never moved, yet I heard his voice as clearly as I hear my own thoughts, felt it resonate in my skull like the tolling of a great bell heard from within. He told me that I had been chosen, that my skill with brush and pigment made me suitable for a great work that would span centuries, that would bridge the gap between what has been and what yet might be. Holmes had produced his notebook and was making quick notations with a small pencil, his movements economical and precise. And what was this great work, Mr. Ashworth? What did Lord Blackwood claim to need from you? Anchors, Edmund said simply, the word falling like a stone into still water. Each painting serves as an anchor, a point of connection between his essence and the physical world. He explained that he has lived for centuries, moving through time in ways I cannot fully comprehend, but that such existence requires tremendous effort, constant maintenance of the connection between consciousness and material form. The paintings serve to strengthen and multiply these connections, each one a thread binding him more firmly to our reality, our time, our place. Watson felt his medical skepticism warring with the evidence of his own senses, the atmosphere of the room pressing against his certainty that rational explanations must exist for all phenomena. But surely, he interjected gently, such an experience could be explained by the power of suggestion, by exhaustion perhaps, or by some subtle influence exerted during the sittings that created an impression of supernatural communication, where none actually occurred. Edmund turned to him with a smile that held more sadness than Watson had ever seen, compressed into a single expression. I thought so too, Dr. Watson, at first. I told myself, I had imagined it, that the strain of concentration combined with the peculiar atmosphere of that darkened study had created a momentary delusion. But then I returned home and found myself compelled to paint. Not wanting to paint, not choosing to paint, but driven by an urgency that overrode my own will as a rider controls a horse. My hands moved across the canvas, following patterns I had not consciously planned. And when I stepped back to see what I had created, I saw Lord Blackwood staring back at me from the canvas, but not as I had painted him that afternoon. No, this was Lord Blackwood as he must have appeared decades earlier, younger, with different clothing, different surroundings. He gestured to a stack of canvases near the window, and Holmes moved to examine them, carefully laying them out in a row on the floor, where the candlelight could reveal their details. Watson joined him, and together they studied what appeared to be a chronological sequence. Lord Blackwood aging backward through time, each painting showing him younger than the last, until the final canvas depicted what might have been a young man of 20 or 25 years, his face smooth and unlined, his eyes already holding that peculiar depth that characterized all the portraits, but softened somehow by youth's lingering innocence. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, and Watson could hear genuine wonder beneath his friend's habitual reserve. The consistency of features across apparent decades, the progressive changes that match natural aging in reverse. Either you possess an extraordinary imagination, Mr. Ashworth, or you have somehow accessed information about Lord Blackwood's appearance across his lifetime through means I cannot yet explain. There are other sequences, Edmund said, moving to different parts of the room and indicating various groupings of canvases. Lord Blackwood, as he appeared in the Victorian era, the Georgian, the Elizabethan, backward and backward through time, until the features become difficult to date with precision, the clothing and settings suggesting periods so remote that historical records grow vague and contradictory. And all of them, Mr. Holmes, all of them came to me not through research or imagination, but through his voice guiding my hand, his will directing my brush, his memories pouring through me like water through a channel carved in stone. The rain outside had intensified, drumming now against the windows with steady insistence, and Watson became aware that the temperature in the room had dropped perceptibly, despite the numerous candles burning throughout the space. His breath, he realized with a start, had become faintly visible in the air before him, wisps of vapor that should not exist in a room so thoroughly illuminated by open flames. He glanced at Holmes and saw that his friend had noticed this phenomenon as well, his grey eyes sharp with calculation as he processed this new datum. Miss Ashworth stirred from her position by the door, taking a hesitant step into the room. "Edmund," she said softly, her voice carrying such tenderness that Watson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Brother, please. You speak of great works and cosmic purposes, but I see only that you are destroying yourself. You barely eat, you hardly sleep. You have abandoned everything that once gave your life meaning and joy. Whatever Lord Blackwood has promised you, whatever visions drive you to this endless labour, surely they are not worth the cost of your health, your sanity, your very life." Edmund looked at his sister with an expression that mingled love and regret, and a strange exultation that transformed his haggard features into something almost transcendent. "Oh, Clara," he said gently, "you cannot understand because you have not heard his voice, have not felt the vast sweep of his existence brushing against your consciousness like the wing of some great bird passing overhead. What is one life, one brief span of years, compared to the privilege of serving as conduit for something so ancient and magnificent? I am become more than myself through this work, elevated beyond the petty concerns of ordinary existence." Before Holmes could respond to this disturbing declaration, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, with such violence that several of the canvases propped against the walls toppled forward, falling with soft thumps onto the floor. The candlelight flickered wildly, shadows leaping and contracting across the walls. And in that moment of disruption, Watson saw, or thought he saw, something impossible. The eyes in every portrait turning simultaneously toward the fallen canvases. A collective movement of painted gazes that should have been fixed and immobile, but which seemed for one breathless instant to possess independent awareness and volition. The moment passed, the candles steadied, and when Watson looked again, the paintings were exactly as they should be. Flat surfaces, bearing skillful illusions of depth and presence, but nothing more. Yet his hands trembled slightly as he helped Holmes gather the fallen canvases, writing them against the wall, and he noticed that his friend's movements had acquired a new tension, a wariness that suggested Holmes, too, had witnessed that impossible moment of animation. Edmund stood unmoved by the disturbance, his attention fixed on some point beyond the room's physical boundaries, his lips moving silently as if in prayer or recitation. The temperature continued its subtle decline, and Watson became aware of an odour he had not noticed before, faint but growing stronger, a scent like old parchment and dried flowers, like the interior of ancient churches or libraries, where time itself seems to have accumulated in layers, where the air holds the compressed essence of centuries. Holmes straightened from arranging the last of the fallen canvases and turned to face Edmund directly, his expression grave. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying absolute clarity and purpose. I must ask you a question, and I require you to answer with complete honesty. Have you at any time visited Lord Blackwood's residence since that 4th sitting? Have you seen him in the flesh, spoken with him face to face, received any physical evidence that would verify his extraordinary claims about his age and nature? Edmund's attention snapped back to the present, his eyes focusing on Holmes with sudden sharpness. No, he admitted after a long pause. I have not returned to Mayfair. The work here consumes all my hours, and besides, Lord Blackwood has made it clear that further physical proximity is unnecessary. The connection between us exists now, independent of distance or material presence. I hear him most strongly here, in this room, surrounded by the anchors we have created together. I see, Holmes said quietly, and Watson heard in those 2 syllables the grinding of his friend's analytical mind, the careful weighing of evidence and possibility. And you accept this voice, these compulsions to paint, without question, without considering that you might be suffering from some form of delusion or external manipulation. A smile touched Edmund's lips, sad and knowing. I considered such explanations initially, Mr. Holmes. I am not, despite appearances, entirely mad, but the proof is undeniable. He crossed to a small desk tucked into one corner of the studio and retrieved a leather-bound volume, its cover worn and cracked with age. This journal belonged to a painter named Thomas Blackwood, no relation to the Lord, but a man who served him in precisely the capacity I now serve. It dates from 1743, and I found it quite by accident in a bookstall near Charing Cross 3 weeks ago. Read it, Mr. Holmes, and then tell me whether my experiences can be dismissed as mere delusion. Holmes accepted the journal with careful hands, opening it to reveal pages covered in a spidery hand. The ink faded to brown, but still legible. Watson moved to read over his friend's shoulder, and together they scanned the entries. Dated fragments describing a commission to paint Lord Blackwood's portrait. Initial sittings that proceeded normally. Then a 4th session, after which everything changed. The language differed from Edmund's, the phrasing more formal and archaic, but the essential narrative remained identical. The voice heard within the mind, the compulsion to paint endless variations, the gradual understanding that the artist served as anchor and channel for something that existed across and through time in ways that defied normal understanding. The last entry, Edmund said softly, describes Thomas Blackwood's growing weakness, his acceptance that the work would consume him utterly, but his belief that such sacrifice served some greater purpose he could not fully comprehend. The journal ends mid-sentence, as if he simply ceased to exist between one word and the next. Watson felt a chill that penetrated to his very bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the room's temperature, and everything to do with the implications of that abruptly terminated journal, that life snuffed out in the midst of sentence and thought. He looked at Edmund Ashworth with new eyes, seeing not merely an obsessed artist, but a man caught in something vast and terrible, a pattern that repeated across centuries with ruthless consistency, consuming its servants and moving onward through time's endless progression. Holmes closed the journal carefully, his face unreadable in the candlelight. "May I keep this for further examination?" he asked. "I should like to verify its authenticity, to determine whether it might have been forged to lend credence to a delusion, or whether it represents genuine historical record." "Take it," Edmund said, with a dismissive wave. Its authenticity is irrelevant to me now. I know the truth of my situation, know it with certainty that transcends evidence or proof. The work continues regardless of what you may discover or conclude. He turned back to his easel, picking up his brush once more, and Watson saw with a physician's trained eye how the man's hands shook, how his entire frame trembled with exhaustion that had been pushed far beyond safe limits. "Mr. Ashworth," Watson said, trying to inject warmth and professional authority into his voice. "You are ill, sir, whether from supernatural causes or from simple physical depletion. You must rest, must eat properly, must step away from this work before it destroys you completely." Edmund touched brush to palette, mixing colours with automatic precision, his gaze already distant again. "The work is nearly complete," he murmured. 347 iterations I have painted. Lord Blackwood tells me only 3 more are required. 3 final anchors to complete the pattern and allow the great transition to occur. I cannot stop now, not when we stand so close to culmination. Miss Ashworth made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, and Watson moved instinctively to support her as she swayed, her face gone even paler than before. Holmes stood very still, his eyes moving between Edmund and the surrounding paintings, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications. The rain drummed on, the candles burned their steady vigil, and the studio seemed to pulse with a rhythm Watson could feel, but not name, as if the room itself had become a living thing, a heart beating in time with forces that existed beyond ordinary perception. "We should leave," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Ashworth requires rest whether he acknowledges it or not, and we have much to discuss and consider. Miss Ashworth, I believe your brother is in no immediate physical danger tonight, though I strongly recommend you monitor him closely and send word immediately if his condition deteriorates further. Tomorrow, Watson and I shall pursue certain inquiries that may shed light on the truth of this extraordinary matter." Edmund did not look up as they moved toward the door, his brush already dancing across the canvas in sure strokes, building another face to join the hundreds that surrounded him. Watson paused at the threshold, looking back at that haunted figure in his paint-stained clothes, wondering whether they would see him alive again, or whether this night marked the beginning of the end that the journal had foreshadowed, that final consumption by forces too large and alien for human comprehension. They descended the stairs in silence, Miss Ashworth leading them with her single candle, the flame casting their shadows, long and distorted against the walls. In the entrance hall, Holmes paused, turning to their hostess with an expression of sympathy tempered by determination. "We will help your brother if we can, Miss Ashworth," he said gently. "But I must warn you that the path forward is unclear, and the dangers may prove greater than any of us yet understand." The night received them like a cold embrace as they stepped from the Ashworth house into Wentworth Place. The My Ashworth house into Wentworth Place. The mist having thickened during their time within that candlelit studio until the street seemed to exist in its own isolated pocket of reality, cut off from the wider city by walls of vapour that reflected the gas lamp's glow in soft halos of diffused light. Watson pulled his coat more tightly around himself, feeling the damp penetrate through layers of wool and cotton, settling into his bones with the particular chill that only London fog could achieve. Behind them, the door closed with a soft click that seemed final somehow, as if sealing away the strangeness they had witnessed within those walls. Though Watson knew the images of those endless portraits would follow him into sleep and beyond. Miss Ashworth stood on the threshold, a pale figure framed by the darkness of the hallway behind her, her hand raised in farewell. That was also supplication, a gesture asking for hope where little seemed available. Holmes touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, then turned and began walking toward the corner where they might hope to find a cab, his long strides eating the distance with that peculiar energy that always animated him when a case had truly captured his interest. Watson followed, glancing back once to see Miss Ashworth still standing there, watching them disappear into the mist before the fog swallowed her form entirely, and they were alone in the grey embrace of the London night. They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps echoing oddly in the muffled atmosphere, the sound seeming to come from all directions at once as it bounced off the fog's invisible walls. Watson found his thoughts circling back repeatedly to Edmund Ashworth's haunted face, to the trembling of those paint-stained hands, to that terrible certainty in his voice when he spoke of serving purposes beyond human understanding. The journal Holmes carried in his pocket seemed to press against Watson's awareness with physical weight, its implications troubling in ways he could not fully articulate even to himself. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked at length, needing to break the silence, to anchor himself in conversation and analysis, rather than drifting further into the unsettling reverie that threatened to claim him. The journal, the paintings, Edmund's condition. What conclusions does that remarkable mind of yours draw from what we witnessed tonight? Holmes was quiet for a moment longer, his profile sharp against the fog's pale backdrop, his eyes fixed on some point ahead that Watson could not see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that Watson had heard only rarely in all their years together, a hesitation that suggested his friend stood at the edges of his usual confident rationality. "I am troubled, Watson," Holmes admitted, his breath visible in the cold air, wisps of vapour joining the surrounding mist. "Deeply troubled. My instinct, my training, everything I have built my methods upon, insists that rational explanation must exist for what we have seen, and yet the evidence accumulates in patterns that resist conventional interpretation. The journal, if authentic, suggests a phenomenon that has repeated across centuries with remarkable consistency. The paintings themselves display technical mastery that seems inconsistent with Edmund's physical and mental deterioration. And the atmosphere in that studio, you felt it too, I think, that sense of presence, of attention being paid from somewhere beyond ordinary perception. A cat darted across their path suddenly, a grey shadow moving through grey mist, its eyes catching the lamplight for one moment before it vanished into the darkness between buildings. The encounter, mundane as it was, somehow served to emphasize the strangeness of everything else. The way ordinary life continued its patterns, while mysteries unfolded in rooms where candles burned and brushes moved at the behest of voices only the artist could hear. They emerged at last onto a wider street where the fog thinned slightly and the sounds of traffic became audible, distant but real, grounding them back in the familiar world of cabs and commerce, of London going about its evening business, oblivious to the strange dramas playing out in its countless rooms and houses. Holmes raised his walking stick to signal a passing hansom, and within moments they were enclosed in its leather interior, the horses' hooves providing a steady rhythm as they made their way back toward Baker Street, "Tomorrow," Holmes said, as the cab swayed and rattled over cobblestones, "we must visit Lord Blackwood's residence in Mayfair. I should like to see the place where this began, to speak with servants if possible, to gather whatever physical evidence might exist to either support or refute the extraordinary claims we have heard. The house itself may tell us much about its master, about whether we deal with a clever manipulator of vulnerable minds, or with something that transcends such ordinary explanation." Watson nodded, then realized Holmes might not see the gesture in the cab's darkness. "And what of the journal?" he asked. "How shall we verify its authenticity?" "I have contacts at the British Museum who specialize in dating documents through analysis of paper, ink, and handwriting," Holmes replied. "Pemberton himself might be able to assist, given his expertise in historical records. If the journal proves genuine, if Thomas Blackwood truly wrote those entries in 1743, then we must adjust our understanding of what is possible, however reluctantly. If it proves a forgery, then we deal with a more conventional mystery. Who created it? Why? And to what end?" The remainder of their journey passed in contemplative silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. The familiar streets of London rolling past beyond the cab's windows like scenery in a theatre, painted backdrops against which human dramas played themselves out in endless variation. By the time they reached Baker Street, the hour had grown late enough that most windows showed darkness, the city settling into its nighttime rhythms, though here and there lights still burned where insomniacs or workers kept vigil against the dark. Mrs. Hudson had left the lamps burning in their rooms, and the fire had been built up against the night's chill, crackling a warm welcome as they climbed the familiar stairs. Watson felt relief wash over him at returning to this sanctuary of rationality, this comfortable space where pipe smoke and book-lined walls spoke of order and understanding, where mysteries could be dissected and analysed without the oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the Ashworth studio. Holmes went immediately to his desk, laying out the journal and beginning a preliminary examination with magnifying glass and measuring tape, his long fingers moving with delicate precision across the aged pages. Watson prepared 2 brandies, the ritual of pouring and measuring providing comfort through its normalcy, and carried one to Holmes before settling into his own chair. The brandy burned pleasantly going down, spreading warmth through his chest, and he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing exhaustion to settle over him like a heavy blanket. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked its measured way toward midnight, each second a small death and rebirth, time's endless progression that cared nothing for human mysteries or fears. "The paper is consistent with mid-18th century manufacture," Holmes said, after several minutes of silent examination, not looking up from his scrutiny. "The ink has faded in ways that suggest genuine age rather than artificial treatment. The handwriting shows characteristics typical of the period, with letter formations and spelling that would be difficult to forge convincingly without considerable expertise. Of course, none of this proves conclusively that Thomas Blackwood wrote these entries, but it does suggest the journal is at least as old as it purports to be." He turned several pages carefully, reading passages aloud in a voice pitched low for the late hour. "Listen to this, Watson. His lordship sat before me as motionless as carved stone, yet I felt his gaze penetrating to the very core of my being, as if he read not merely my surface thoughts, but the accumulated memories of all my days, the secret architecture of of my soul. When at last he spoke, though his lips remained closed and still, I heard his voice resonate within my skull, like the tolling of bells heard from within a cathedral tower. He told me that I had been chosen, that my skill would serve to bind him more firmly to the world of solid things, and though I wished to flee that darkened room, I found myself unable to move, held fast by a will far stronger than my own. The words hung in the air between them, made somehow more disturbing by the comfortable domesticity of their surroundings, the contrast between the fireside's warmth and the implications of what Holmes had read. Watson set down his brandy glass with exaggerated care, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile in the room's atmosphere. It is nearly identical to Edmund Ashworth's account, Watson observed quietly. The fourth sitting, the voice heard internally, the sense of compulsion overriding personal will. If this journal is genuine, Holmes, then we must seriously consider the possibility that Lord Blackwood has indeed lived for centuries, that he possesses some power or knowledge that allows him to extend his existence through means we cannot yet comprehend. Holmes rose from his desk and moved to stand before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp against the flame's glow. For a long time he simply stood thus, gazing into the fire's dancing heart, as if seeking answers in its ever-shifting patterns. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confronting possibilities. His rational mind insisted must be impossible, yet which evidence continued to support. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio," Holmes quoted softly, "than are dreamt of in your philosophy. I have spent my career building methods to explain the apparently inexplicable, to reduce mystery to mechanism, to show that behind every seemingly supernatural occurrence lies a natural explanation waiting to be discovered. And yet, Watson, I am forced to acknowledge that our understanding of natural law may be incomplete, that there may exist phenomena which, while ultimately explicable, operate according to principles we have not yet identified or categorized." Dawn broke with reluctance over London, the sun rising pale and uncertain behind layers of cloud that seemed determined to hold the city in perpetual twilight. Watson woke in his chair to find he had dozed off without meaning to, without meaning to. The empty brandy glass balanced precariously on the arm where his hand had released it during sleep's gentle theft of consciousness. Holmes stood at the window, already dressed, though Watson could not recall his friend retiring at all, and suspected he had spent the entire night in study and contemplation, fueled by that peculiar energy that sometimes gripped him when a case proved particularly compelling. The detective's silhouette against the grey morning light held a quality of absolute stillness, like a statue carved from shadow and placed there by some careful sculptor, and Watson knew better than to interrupt whatever thoughts occupied that remarkable mind. The city below was waking to its daily rhythms, carts and wagons beginning their rounds, shopkeepers raising shutters, the whole vast mechanism of London commerce stirring to life, with groans and creaks and the shuffle of countless feet on stone. Yet even this familiar dawn seemed somehow touched by the strangeness of the previous night, as if Edmund Ashworth's haunted studio had cast shadows that extended beyond its walls, reaching out to taint the ordinary world with suggestions of mysteries that refuse to stay confined within their proper boundaries. Watson rose stiffly, his neck protesting the awkward angle at which he had slept, and moved to join Holmes at the window, looking down into Baker Street, where morning mist curled and eddied around the feet of passers-by, like phantom cats seeking attention. "You have been awake all night," Watson observed, though it was not really a question. He knew his friend's patterns well enough after their years together, knew the signs of a mind too engaged with problems to permit the luxury of rest. "Have you reached any conclusions about our extraordinary case?" Holmes turned from the window at last, and Watson saw that exhaustion had etched fine lines around his grey eyes, though they remained sharp with focus and purpose. "I have reached several hypotheses," Holmes replied, moving to the table where Mrs. Hudson had already laid out breakfast, steam rising from covered dishes in aromatic invitation. None of them entirely satisfactory, all of them troubling in their implications. But we shall test them today through direct observation and inquiry. Lord Blackwood's residence awaits our visit, and I am most curious to see what secrets that house may reveal. They ate in contemplative silence, the familiar ritual of breakfast providing anchor and comfort, hot tea and toast with marmalade grounding them in the world of physical necessity and ordinary appetite. Through the windows, the morning continued its slow brightening, though the sun remained hidden behind clouds that promised rain before day's end. Another cycle of dampness to follow the night's mist. London's autumn asserting itself with gentle but persistent insistence. Watson found his thoughts drifting back repeatedly to Miss Ashworth's pale face, to her brother's trembling hands, to those hundreds of painted eyes, all staring with that peculiar intensity that suggested awareness beyond what paint and canvas should contain. By 10 o'clock, they were ready to depart, Holmes having armed himself with various tools of investigation: magnifying lens, measuring tape, compass, and several small vials for collecting samples, should such prove necessary. Watson carried his medical bag out of habit, more than expectation of need, though some instinct suggested that before this case reached its conclusion, his skills might be called upon in ways he could not yet anticipate. They descended to the street and found a cab with little difficulty, the morning traffic having thinned to more manageable levels, and Holmes gave the driver an address in Mayfair, his voice carrying that note of authority that discouraged questions or conversation. The journey took them through gradually more affluent neighbourhoods, the architecture growing grander, the streets wider and cleaner, the whole atmosphere speaking of wealth accumulated and carefully maintained across generations. Mayfair in the morning possessed a peculiar quality of hushed discretion, as if the very buildings conspired to keep their inhabitants' secrets, to maintain veils of privacy around lives lived according to different rules than those governing ordinary London. The cab turned onto a street lined with imposing townhouses, their facades presenting blank faces to the world, windows heavily curtained, doors painted in sober colours that suggested respectability without ostentation. Number 43 stood near the middle of the block, distinguished from its neighbours by an air of profound neglect that verged on abandonment. The windows were not merely curtained, but shuttered from within. Dark wood panels, visible through grimy glass, and the brass fittings that adorned the door had tarnished to dull green, lacking the polish that marked every other house on the street. The small garden that fronted the property had surrendered to chaos, weeds growing tall between neglected shrubs, and the gate hung slightly askew on hinges that protested with rusty squeals when Holmes pushed it open. They approached the door with caution, born of instinct rather than rational fear, and Watson found himself acutely aware of sounds. The distant rumble of traffic from larger streets, a dog barking several houses away, the whisper of wind through the overgrown garden, but from the house itself only silence, deep and complete, as if the building held its breath against intrusion. Holmes raised the knocker, heavy iron fashioned in the shape of some creature Watson could not quite identify. Neither lion nor dragon, but something that combined elements of both, and let it fall 3 times, the sound echoing within as if the house contained vast empty spaces, rather than the rooms one would expect in a London townhouse. They waited, minutes accumulating like water drops in a slowly filling vessel. But no footsteps approached from within. No servant came to inquire about their business. Holmes knocked again, louder this time, but still received no response, save echoes dying away into interior darkness. He tried the door handle and found it locked, as expected, but something in the quality of that locked resistance seemed different from an ordinary secured door, as if the house itself actively resisted entry rather than merely being closed against the world. "Around back, Watson," Holmes said quietly, gesturing toward the narrow passage that ran between this house and its neighbour. "There may be a servant's entrance less thoroughly secured, or, at minimum, a window through which we might observe the interior." They made their way down the passage, which was barely wide enough for them to walk single file, the walls rising on either side, creating a corridor of damp shadow, where moss grew on stone, and the smell of decay hung thick in the still air. The passage opened onto a small courtyard at the building's rear, paved with broken flagstones and dominated by a dead tree that reached skeletal branches toward the grey sky like a supplicant frozen in eternal plea. The back of the house showed windows on 3 levels, all shuttered like those at the front. But the door here appeared less formidable, plain wood rather than the heavy oak of the main entrance. Holmes tried this door as well, and found it similarly locked, though when he pressed his ear against its surface, Watson saw his expression sharpen with interest. "Listen," Holmes murmured, stepping aside to allow Watson access to the door. Watson pressed his ear to the wood, and heard what had caught his friend's attention. A sound like breathing, deep and slow, rhythmic as ocean waves, emanating from somewhere within the house's depths. It was not quite human in quality, suggesting something larger, or perhaps many. Somethings breathing in perfect synchronization, creating a chorus of inhalation and exhalation that seemed to make the very structure tremble faintly with each cycle. "Good Lord," Watson breathed, stepping back from the door with a chill running down his spine. What could produce such a sound? Before Holmes could answer, a crash from within the house made them both start. The sound of something heavy falling or being thrown, followed by a moment of profound silence before that strange breathing resumed. Holmes's hand went to his pocket, where Watson knew he kept a set of lockpicks, tools he had mastered with the same thoroughness he brought to all his pursuits, and in moments he had the lock surrendering to his expertise, the door swinging inward on hinges that protested with shrill squeals. Darkness greeted them, absolute and oppressive, the kind of darkness that seems to have weight and substance, that presses against the eyes like a physical barrier. Holmes produced matches from his pocket and struck one, the small flame pushing back the dark by inches, revealing a narrow corridor with walls papered in a pattern so faded and water-stained as to be indistinguishable. The floor covered in dust thick enough to show clearly the tracks of someone who had walked this way recently, footprints leading deeper into the house's interior. They followed these tracks with Holmes holding the light before them, each match burning down until his fingers forced him to drop it and strike another. The succession of small flames creating a stuttering illumination that made shadows jump and dance along the walls. The breathing sound grew louder as they advanced, and with it came that smell Watson had noticed in Edmund's studio. That scent of old parchment and dried flowers mixed now with something else, something mineral and vaguely metallic, that reminded Watson of blood, though he could see no evidence of injury or violence. The corridor opened at last into what must have been a formal parlour in the house's former incarnation as a residence, though now it had been transformed into something else entirely. The furniture had been pushed against the walls or removed altogether, creating a large open space whose floor bore a pattern painted directly onto the boards. Concentric circles, connected by lines and symbols that Watson recognized from his reading as attempts at occult significance, though whether they served any purpose beyond theatrical effect he could not say. Around the room's perimeter stood dozens of candles, unlit at present, but clearly positioned with deliberate care, and between them hung masks from various cultures: African, Asian, Polynesian, each one carved with exquisite skill, to depict faces that seemed to watch the room's centre with expressions ranging from benevolence to malice. But it was the room's centre that arrested their full attention, that made Watson's breath catch in his throat, and caused even Holmes to pause in his methodical advance. There, arranged in a circle, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, stood paintings, portraits identical to those filling Edmund Ashworth's studio. The same face repeated over and over, Lord Blackwood staring out from canvas after canvas with those fathomless eyes. Each portrait slightly different in costume and setting, but united in that peculiar quality of presence, of awareness that seemed to extend beyond the painted surface into the very air of the room. Watson counted 37 portraits arranged in that perfect circle, each one positioned with mathematical precision at intervals that suggested deliberate calculation rather than aesthetic arrangement. The paintings faced inward, creating an amphitheatre of painted gazes, all focused on the circle's empty centre. And in that convergence of attention, Watson felt something. Watson felt something he could not name, a sensation like standing at the nexus of invisible lines of force that pulled and pressed from all directions simultaneously. Holmes moved forward slowly, his latest match guttering and requiring a replacement, the new flame casting wavering light across those dozens of faces, each one Lord Blackwood, and yet somehow different, as if the portraits captured not merely appearance, but essence across spans of time that stretched beyond mortal reckoning. The breathing sound that permeated the house seemed to emanate from the paintings themselves, though Watson's rational mind insisted this must be illusion, some acoustic property of the room's dimensions, amplifying sounds from elsewhere in the building. Yet, when he moved closer to examine one portrait, Lord Blackwood, rendered in what appeared to be Renaissance finery, the clothing suggesting wealth and power from centuries past, he could have sworn he saw the chest beneath that painted doublet rise and fall with subtle rhythm, synchronized with the breathing that filled the air around them like an invisible presence. Holmes had produced his dark lantern now, opening its shutter to to cast a more stable illumination across the room's strange contents. The increased light revealed details previously hidden. Symbols painted in what might have been silver or white gold along the edges of each canvas frame. Characters that resembled no alphabet Watson recognized, but which possessed an unsettling quality of intentionality, as if they represented language condensed to its most essential forms. Between the portraits, on the floor itself, similar symbols had been inscribed within the larger pattern of circles and connecting lines, creating a web of meaning that Watson suspected would require years of study to even begin deciphering. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, moving around the circle's perimeter with careful steps that avoided disturbing the painted symbols on the floor. "This is not the work of days or even weeks, Watson. The precision of placement, the complexity of the pattern, the sheer number of portraits, all suggest sustained effort over considerable time. And see here," he indicated several canvases that showed signs of age beyond the others, their surfaces cracked and darkened. "These are older works, decades old at minimum, perhaps centuries. They have been gathered from various sources and arranged according to some plan whose full purpose we have not yet grasped." A sudden draft moved through the room, though Watson could identify no source for it, no open window or door that might admit outside air. The candles around the perimeter trembled in response, though they remained unlit, and for one disorienting moment, Watson thought he saw flame flicker in their wicks, despite the absence of any spark to kindle them. The moment passed, leaving him uncertain whether his eyes had deceived him, or whether something in this room operated according to rules that defied ordinary physics. Holmes had moved to examine a desk pushed against one wall, its surface covered with papers and implements that suggested both scholarly research and practical ritual. He lifted pages carefully, scanning their contents with that rapid absorption that allowed him to extract relevant information from volumes of text in minutes, where other men might require hours. Watson joined him, looking over his friend's shoulder at diagrams that showed the room's pattern in various stages of development, notes written in multiple hands and languages, dates scattered across the pages, ranging from the previous week back through months and years, even centuries if the dates could be trusted. "This is a map," Holmes said quietly, his finger tracing lines on one particularly detailed diagram. Or rather, it depicts something for which map serves as inadequate metaphor. "These portraits, Watson, they are not merely representations, but anchor points, as Edmund Ashworth suggested. Each one serves to bind Lord Blackwood's consciousness to a specific moment in time and space, creating a network of connections that span centuries. The pattern on the floor shows these connections made visible, rendered in 2 dimensions what exists across 4. Watson struggled to grasp the implications of what Holmes described, his mind seeking footholds in concepts that seemed to slide away from comprehension like water through grasping fingers. But to what purpose? He asked. Why create such an elaborate construction? What does Lord Blackwood gain from binding himself thus across time? Before Holmes could respond, the breathing sound that had been constant since their entry suddenly ceased, leaving a silence so absolute it seemed to ring in Watson's ears like the aftermath of a great bell's tolling. In that silence, they heard footsteps on the floor above, slow and deliberate, measured as drum beats, crossing from one side of the house to the other before pausing directly overhead. Both men froze, hands moving instinctively to pockets. Holmes to his revolver, Watson to his medical bag, though what aid medicine might provide in such circumstances he could not imagine. The footsteps resumed, descending now. Coming downstairs, Watson had not noticed in their focused examination of the parlour's contents. They emerged into a hallway Watson glimpsed through an open door, and then a figure appeared in the doorway itself, backlit by some source of illumination from the corridor beyond, creating a silhouette that revealed height and bearing, but left features obscured in shadow. "Gentlemen," a voice said, dry as autumn leaves skittering across stone, inflected with accents Watson could not place, but which suggested antiquity. The vowels shaped by tongues that had formed them before modern English established its current patterns. "I have been expecting visitors, though I confess I anticipated them somewhat later in our unfolding drama. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume, and his faithful companion, Dr. Watson. Welcome to my home, such as it has become in this particular iteration of existence." The figure moved forward into the lantern's light, and Watson found himself looking upon the face he had seen reproduced across hundreds of canvases, the features he had studied in Edmund Ashworth's obsessive renderings, and in the ancient portraits surrounding them now. Lord Blackwood in the flesh proved both exactly as depicted, and somehow more, as if the paintings captured only surface appearance, while missing some essential quality that animated the living man, some force or presence that paint and canvas could only approximate without fully containing. He appeared as an elderly gentleman, perhaps 70 or 80 years of age, though his posture remained upright, and his movements carried none of the stiffness Watson associated with advanced years. The eyes were exactly as portrayed, dark and fathomless, seeming to contain depths that extended far beyond the physical structures of iris and pupil. Windows, indeed, unto abysses, as that ancient account had described. He wore a dressing gown of dark velvet over formal clothing, and his hands, long-fingered and pale, moved with deliberate grace as he gestured toward the circle of portraits. "You have discovered my gallery," Lord Blackwood said, and something in his tone suggested amusement mixed with satisfaction, as if their presence fulfilled expectations he had held for some time. "My collection of selves, one might say, anchors scattered across the centuries to hold fast against the current that would otherwise sweep consciousness away into the undifferentiated void. Each portrait represents a moment of connection, a point where the thread of my existence pierces through the fabric of linear time and creates a lasting mark, a place to which I might return should the need arise." Holmes had recovered from his initial surprise, and now regarded Lord Blackwood with that penetrating gaze Watson had seen him turn upon countless subjects of investigation. "You speak of existing across time as if it were a matter of navigation, rather than the inexorable progression we all experience," Holmes said carefully. "Are we to understand that you claim to have lived for centuries, moving backward and forward through history at will?" A smile touched Lord Blackwood's thin lips, expressing neither warmth nor mockery, but something else, something that might have been sadness or perhaps weariness beyond anything Watson's experience could encompass. "Not at will, Mr. Holmes. That is the crucial distinction. My existence extends across centuries, yes, but not through choice or design. I am cursed, if you will, or blessed, depending upon one's philosophy, to experience time not as a river flowing in one direction, but as an ocean in which consciousness drifts without anchor. touching upon moments scattered across the span of recorded history and beyond. The portraits serve to create stability, fixed points to which I can cling, lest I dissolve entirely into temporal chaos. Watson found his voice at last, the physician in him asserting itself despite the strangeness of the situation. "That is impossible," he said, though his tone carried more wonder than conviction. "Human consciousness requires continuity, requires the brain's physical structures to maintain identity and memory. What you describe would necessitate existing simultaneously in multiple moments, experiencing countless versions of yourself across different periods. Impossible by your current understanding of natural law," Lord Blackwood agreed, moving further into the room and standing now at the edge of the circle, his shadow cast by the lantern's light falling across several of the portraits. "And yet, here I stand, living testament to realities your science has not yet encompassed. I have walked in ancient Rome and stood upon battlefields where empires clashed in ages before writing recorded such events. I have observed the construction of monuments your archaeologists puzzle over, and conversed with minds that shaped the course of human civilization in ways history has forgotten." Holmes stood very still, processing this declaration with that remarkable mind Watson had witnessed navigate countless mysteries, though never before one that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. The lantern light cast shifting shadows across the detective's angular features, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality, not quite acceptance, but a willingness to suspend the disbelief that rational training had instilled. "The paintings," Holmes said slowly, each word carefully measured. "Edmund Ashworth believes he paints them under your direction, guided by your voice speaking within his mind. Yet you say they serve as anchors for your consciousness across time. How do these two functions reconcile? Why do you require new portraits when dozens, perhaps hundreds, already exist?" Lord Blackwood moved to stand within the circle of paintings, positioning himself at its exact centre, and Watson noted how the painted gazes seemed to converge upon him, how the breathing sound that had ceased earlier now resumed, synchronized somehow with the rise and fall of the living man's chest. "The anchors decay," Lord Blackwood explained, his voice taking on a quality of patient instruction, as if speaking to students eager to understand complex principles. "Not physically, though time does work its usual degradation upon canvas and pigment, but energetically. The connection between consciousness and portrait weakens with the passage of years, requires renewal and reinforcement. Each generation I must find new artists, souls whose sensitivity and skill make them suitable channels for the work of binding." He turned slowly, his gaze moving across the assembled portraits, and Watson saw in his ancient eyes something that might have been grief, or might have been resignation, the look of one who has repeated the same patterns so many times, that they have become both comfort and prison. "Thomas Blackwood served me well in his time, as did others before him whose names have been lost even to my fragmentary memory. Edmund Ashworth possesses remarkable talent, a combination of technical skill and unconscious receptivity that makes him ideal for this work. Through him, I have created 347 new anchors, each one a point of light in the darkness of temporal drift, each one a handhold preventing my complete dissolution into the endless now." Watson felt compelled to speak, his concern for Edmund overriding his awe at the impossibility standing before them. "But it is destroying him," he said, his voice carrying the authority of medical knowledge and human compassion. "Mr. Ashworth barely eats, rarely sleeps, has abandoned everything in service to your need for these anchors. If he continues at this pace, he will die, consumed by the work you have set him." For the first time, Lord Blackwood's expression shifted towards something recognizable as human emotion. Regret, perhaps, or sorrow, though whether for Edmund's fate or for his own necessity, Watson could not determine. "Yes," he acknowledged quietly, "the work does consume its servants. I do not take pleasure in this truth, Dr. Watson. Yet I am bound by imperatives beyond my control or desire. Without the anchors, I disperse, become nothing. Consciousness scattered across so many moments and places that identity itself ceases to have meaning. I would become a ghost, haunting all of time simultaneously, present everywhere and nowhere, aware of everything and capable of nothing." Holmes had been examining the symbols on the floor during this exchange, and now he looked up with sudden understanding, lighting his features. 347, he repeated. "Edmund mentioned that number, said you told him only 3 more were required. 350 total. That is no arbitrary figure, is it? That number possesses significance within this pattern you have created." A smile of genuine approval crossed Lord Blackwood's face, transforming him briefly into something almost warm, almost human in the ordinary sense. "Astute, Mr. Holmes, as I would expect from one of your reputation. 350 represents a mathematical necessity, a number derived from calculations involving temporal mechanics that your science has not yet formulated, but which governs the spacing of anchors across the centuries. With 350 points of binding, the network achieves stability sufficient to hold consciousness intact indefinitely, or as near to indefinitely as makes no practical difference. And with only 347, Watson said, comprehension dawning, the network remains incomplete, unstable, requiring constant attention and maintenance. But once the final 3 are completed, I will be free," Lord Blackwood finished. "Free to exist without the constant fear of dissolution. Free to experience time's flow without being swept away by it. Edmund Ashworth will have served his purpose and can return to his ordinary life, his ordinary painting, his sister's company and care. The compulsion that drives him will cease the moment the pattern achieves completion." Holmes crossed to stand beside Watson, and the 2 friends exchanged a glance that communicated volumes without words. They stood at a crossroads of decision, facing a choice that carried implications, extending far beyond the immediate situation. To help complete the pattern meant enabling something that challenged every principle of natural order they had been raised to accept. To prevent its completion meant consigning Edmund Ashworth to continued torment and possible death, while also potentially dooming Lord Blackwood to the dissolution he described with such evident dread. "How do we know?" Holmes asked at last, his voice gentle but firm. "That you speak truth. That completion of the pattern will indeed release Edmund from your influence. We have only your word, and you have demonstrated remarkable power to manipulate and compel. Perhaps the 350 is merely a number chosen to gain our cooperation, while in reality you intend to continue using Edmund and others like him indefinitely." Lord Blackwood regarded Holmes with those fathomless eyes, and Watson saw in them something that might have been respect for for the question's directness. "You do not know," he admitted simply. "You must choose whether to trust, whether to extend faith where certainty cannot exist. I have lived so long, gentlemen, have seen so much of human hope and human folly. And I tell you now, with all the weight of those centuries behind my words, I am weary beyond your comprehension. I do not desire servants or slaves, do not wish to consume the lives and wills of sensitive artists, generation after generation. I wish only for stability, for an end to this endless drifting, for something approximating the peace that ordinary mortality provides through its limits and boundaries." Silence settled over the room, like snow falling in a windless night. Each man wrapped in his own thoughts, considering choices and consequences that seemed to extend far beyond the immediate moment. The portraits watched with their painted eyes. Lord Blackwood stood patient and still at the circle's centre, and somewhere beyond the shuttered windows, London continued its morning business, oblivious to the extraordinary drama unfolding in this darkened house. Finally, Holmes spoke, his decision made. "We will help complete the pattern," he said quietly. "Not because we fully trust or understand, but because Edmund Ashworth's life hangs in the balance, and we are not willing to sacrifice it on the altar of our uncertainty. But know this, Lord Blackwood, we will be watching. If the pattern's completion does not free Edmund as you claim, if any harm continues to befall him or others, I will dedicate every resource at my disposal to finding a way to break what you have built. Consequences be damned." Lord Blackwood inclined his head in acknowledgement, the gesture carrying strange dignity. I would expect nothing less from Sherlock Holmes. Return to Edmund. Guide his hand through the final 3 portraits. The pattern will show him what is needed. He has become so attuned to the work that conscious direction is no longer necessary. By tomorrow's dawn, the great binding will be complete, and he will wake as if from a long dream, exhausted but free. They left him standing there among his gallery of selves, and made their way back through the house's darkness to emerge blinking into morning light that seemed impossibly bright and normal after the shadows they had inhabited. The journey back to Bloomsbury passed in contemplative quiet, both men processing what they had witnessed, what they had agreed to facilitate. By the time they reached Wentworth Place, Watson felt he had aged years in the space of hours, his understanding of reality fundamentally altered in ways he could not yet fully articulate. Miss Ashworth met them at the door, her face showing hope and fear in equal measure, and they explained what must be done. Together they climbed to Edmund's studio, where they found him already at work, his brush moving across canvas with mechanical precision, building yet another face from the endless supply that seemed to flow through him from somewhere beyond ordinary inspiration. Holmes and Watson settled into chairs to keep vigil, watching as the hours unfolded and the paintings emerged, 3 final anchors to complete a pattern centuries in the making. The work continued through afternoon into evening, Edmund painting without pause, while outside the sky darkened and stars emerged from behind the city's perpetual veil of smoke and cloud. Watson dozed fitfully in his chair, waking periodically to find Holmes still alert, still watching with that unwavering attention he brought to matters of importance. Miss Ashworth brought tea and sandwiches that no one touched, her presence a quiet comfort in the candlelit room, where her brother's hands moved with surety, born of forces beyond his conscious control. And then, near midnight, it was finished. Edmund stepped back from the final canvas, his brush falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. And Watson saw awareness return to his eyes like light dawning after endless night. The young artist swayed, would have fallen had Watson not sprung forward to catch him, lowering him gently to the floor, where he lay, breathing deeply, peacefully, the terrible tension that had animated him for months finally released. "Clara," Edmund whispered, his sister's name emerging like prayer. And she was there, kneeling beside him with tears streaming down her face, gathering him close while Holmes and Watson withdrew to give the siblings their moment of reunion. They left Wentworth Place as dawn touched the eastern sky with fingers of rose and gold. The city waking to another day that would contain its usual mixture of mundane and extraordinary, ordinary citizens going about their business, while mysteries resolved themselves in quiet rooms where candles burned low and exhausted artists slept the sleep of the finally freed. Back at Baker Street, Watson found himself standing at the window, watching the street come alive with morning activity, cabs and carts and people pursuing their purposes under a sky that promised fair weather after days of rain and mist. Holmes sat in his chair with pipe lit, smoke curling lazy patterns in the strengthening light, and neither man felt need to speak of what they had witnessed, what they had helped facilitate. The days that followed brought confirmation that Edmund Ashworth recovered his health and returned to his ordinary work, painting portraits for ordinary clients, with skill undiminished but compulsion mercifully absent. Of Lord Blackwood they heard nothing more. The house in Mayfair, standing silent and apparently empty, though whether its occupant had finally achieved the stability he sought, or had dispersed into the temporal chaos he feared, Watson could not say, and found he preferred not to know. Some mysteries, he reflected, as the case faded into memory, are better left with their questions intact, their resolutions known but not fully understood, existing in that twilight space between explanation and wonder, where the extraordinary brushes against the ordinary, and transforms both in ways subtle but profound. And so, dear friend, we reach the end of our strange tale, this journey through candlelit studios and houses where time itself seems to bend and fold upon itself. If you have found comfort in this mystery, if these words have carried you gently toward the sleep we all seek at day's end, then please consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like to help others find these stories, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. May your dreams be peaceful, your sleep be deep, and may you wake refreshed to face whatever mysteries tomorrow brings. Good night, wherever you find yourself tonight, and remember, the world contains wonders both seen and unseen, stories written in shadows and light, patterns that connect us across time and space in ways we are only beginning to understand. Sleep well, and let the rain's gentle whisper carry you into realms where mysteries resolve themselves, and all questions find their answers in the soft embrace of dreams.